Last week we reviewed the DJI O4 Air unit, and although this thing is very small and can technically be powered by a 1S drone, there were some concerns including a narrow field of view, lower power output, and somewhat lackluster dynamic range. Well, DJI have said to address all those concerns with the new DJI O4 Air Unit Pro. So let's open this up and see what's changed. Okay, so here it is, the DJI O4 Air Unit Pro. And although earlier I compared this to the original O4 Air unit, this is more of a direct replacement for the O3 Air unit. Now the O3 performed very well, but as they say, the show must go on. Now DJI has said to increase the performance of the O3 in almost every way. So let's open this up and see if that's true. And the first thing I see here is a user manual. Let's get it out of here. Pretty nice O4 unit series. Next we have the camera and VTX setup right here. Comes out as like one unit here. And this thing looks surprisingly a lot smaller than I expected. Oh, here's some more stuff here. A silica gel to keep this thing all dry. And this special harness to go from the VTX to the actual flight control. That's important, we can't lose that. We're trying to fish this out, and here it is. All right, now this thing here looks surprisingly smaller than I expected, guys. The camera it looks larger for sure, and it actually is. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the DJI O4 Air Unit Pro. Now, as I said before, this thing looks a little bit smaller and lighter than I expect. Usually when you make a more powerful model, it's usually a bit bulkier. Now, DJI said this thing weighs around 32 grams without the antenna and around 2 grams each for the antenna. So we're looking at around maybe 36 grams here total. We'll see if that's true. Right on the dot, 36 grams. And actually, believe it or not, that's actually lighter than the DJI O4 Air unit. It's almost the same size. It looks a little bit thinner. Now the first thing I see here are these mounting holes right here, which is pretty cool. Now typically you'd have a 30 by 30 mounting solution for these, but DJI gives you two options here. You have a 30 by 30 as well as a 25 by 25 mounting solution. So you can mount this thing on various drones, even whoops guys. So that's pretty impressive overall. You also have all these fins on here. Now this does feel like some kind of an alloy where this should dissipate heat pretty easily, but there's tons more fins on here and a lot more ventilation on this VTX overall. So I do suspect this thing is gonna get hot pretty quick and probably even hotter than the actual O3. Now on the right side here, you have a USB-C port on here, which is similar to the O3 on here. And this is to update the firmware on your VTX as well to transfer files to or from the actual built-in memory. Now there's a smaller memory on this one. This one has a 2 gig memory, just in case you do forget your SD card. And it's kind of weird because the original or the smaller or standard Air unit has around 22 to 23 gigs of memory on here. So it's kind of weird that the Pro model has less memory than the actual standard unit, but I do get it. This one here is weight sensitive, designed for smaller whoops. So they didn't want to include the added weight for smaller drones. I do get that. So 2 gigs isn't a lot, but it's better than nothing. And there's been multiple times I've left the house with the SD card still in the computer, and then I had nothing to record on. So I'll take 2 gigs over nothing overall. Now on the opposite side, you do have the slot here for your micro SD card slot. As I said before, this thing here does record in 4K, so you're gonna have some pretty large files. And if you're using this setup right here, you're probably a professional, maybe just an enthusiast who wants better image quality. But you do have most production companies who prefer an SD card slot to install into the computer or laptop to do some editing. So that's a welcome sign right here. And right below it, you do have a bind button. That's pretty standard of all their VTX to combine this with your goggles. Now on the back here, you have 2 antennas. You actually have 2 connections right here, almost like the old one on the O3. These are UFL connectors on here, but there's a slight difference on here. In the O3, you did have 2 connections, but it did combine into 1 antenna mass. In this case, you have 2 separate antennas here, very similar to the original Air unit here, and this should give you better reception, somewhat like a diversity if you want to mount this in a 90-degree fashion right here. So that's what I plan to do once I do install this on my drone. Now on the back here, you also have a connection here for your flight control. This is the plug here or port for the harness right here. And one end goes into the VTX while the other end goes into a compatible flight controller. Now, most modern flight controllers do have a plug like this for a modern or digital VTX, and that eliminates all the soldering to connect this to your drone. Now, in the instance you do have to hardwire this to your drone, then you can plug one end into your VTX and then just snip the other end and then just solder it to your flight controller. Now talking about that, this thing here has a power range or value between 2 and 6S. This is not gonna work with 1S batteries, or over 6S, it could damage this board here overall. You don't want it because this is pretty expensive board or VTX overall. I highly recommend you put it to the BEC. As I said before, most flight controllers will have either a 5-volt or a 9-volt BEC on board. Now right above that port there, you do have the MIPI cable right here. This thing looks pretty impressive. They do give you a quite long MIPI cable on here. Now this looks very similar to the one on the O3, but it is different, so you can't transfer the one from the O3 and reuse this old cable here. Now that leads us to the camera right here, and this thing here is a beast. Now when the O3 camera came out, guys were like, wow, this is a pretty huge camera, but this thing kind of dwarfs it. You can see how much larger it is. Now that's because we do have a larger sensor in this. This one here is a 1/1.3 inch sensor. We're getting closer and closer to that 1 inch sensor, and that leads to better image quality, better dynamic range, and that's a better overall image overall, especially if you're in the low light conditions. You have a bigger sensor that can receive more light to the sensor. Now in the daytime, if that becomes a problem, if there's too much light coming into the sensor, then you might want to use something like an ND filter to control the light going to it. I have one here by Freewell, and once I get this installed on my drone, I'll be doing a further test on these filters to see how they actually impact or hopefully improve the image on this O4 Air unit. Now besides that, we do have the same 155-degree field of view, which is really good for FPV flying, especially if you're gonna stabilize your image in this DVR or using the Gyroflow software. Now besides that, because of the larger sensor, unfortunately we do have a larger camera case. You can see this thing is a little bit wider. This is around 22 millimeters wide, so a little bit wider than the one on the O3. It seems like, well, it is getting bigger. This is a bigger sensor on here that leads to better image, but that leads to other problems, meaning like these standard O3 dimensions here isn't gonna fit. On top of that, we do have a new mounting system on here. We do have 2 mounts on each side, which is somewhat similar to what we see here on the O3. We do have 2 screws on each side, but because of this new design, we do have them spaced out a little bit more. So your O3 mount isn't gonna work with this new camera here. And now you see a lot of manufacturers scrambling to update their frames and make a compatible drone for the O4 system. I wish DJI would have just kept the same distance between the 2 holes, and then we can just use the same mounting on the O3, but that's not gonna work. Now I do suspect a lot of guys will try to 3D print their own mount, and I've actually done that for some of my drones, and that's what I'll be doing with this camera here in a few days, installing this in one of my existing drones. Now this case here, as I said before, we do have the mounting holes in here. We do see the addition of like some fins on the back of this camera here to aid in cooling, and it is made of some alloy as well. Now one new feature of the O4 system is what they call race mode, and that's a pretty cool feature where DJI increases the refresh rate in your goggles and lowers the latency from the camera to your goggles. So we're getting latency as low as around 50 milliseconds if you're using the goggles 3, and around 19 milliseconds if you're using the goggles N3. Now you might say that's still pretty high compared to some of the other protocols in the market, like say HD0, but if you consider the latency on traditional O3 cameras were around 30 milliseconds or so. So you're cutting that in half, guys. In addition to that, you are lowering the output on the VTX, so now you're gonna have around 25 milliwatts. So you can compete this with other drones if you're gonna compete in a race here. So it's pretty cool. I don't own the goggles 3, I do have the N3. And that's one thing to note, guys. This race mode is only compatible with those 2 goggles at the time of filming. We're talking about the goggles 3 and the goggles N3, meaning only O4 compatible goggles have this feature. If you have the goggles Integra, goggles 2, then you're not gonna have this race mode. There's no feature for that. All right, guys, so the O4 Air unit here looks pretty impressive, to be honest with you, on paper. I haven't installed this yet. It looks really impressive. Everything looks good so far. The quality of DJI is really good. The hardware looks pretty nice. The camera looks pretty bulky, but the overall weight is still lighter than the previous version of this camera here. So they are making some incremental improvements. So what do you think about this system overall? Are you gonna pick this up? Are you gonna buy this for your drone overall? Or are you gonna race with the O4 Air unit? I'm curious to know what what you think about this overall. What are my plans for the O4 Air Unit Pro? Well, I do plan to install this in one of my drones. And if you're interested in seeing the image quality from this and how this thing performs, hit that subscribe button. Therefore, you'll be notified whenever I do drop that video. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.